Hello, I'm Murray Lumpkin, and in these modules we're now going to be looking in much more depth at how the US FDA and the European Medicines Agency regulate medical products within their jurisdictions. The learning objectives for this particular session is that I hope that you will develop an initial understanding of the mission, the organization, and a much greater understanding of the scope of responsibilities of the US FDA and the European Medicines Agency. Likewise, I hope you develop an initial understanding of the roles both the US FDA and the EMA play in the oversight of the development, the authorization, and the post-authorization life cycle of medical products. Let's turn first to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. It's commonly known as the FDA, and I think because people tend to think of it as the drug regulator in the United States, they believe that FDA stands for Federal Drug Administration. Well, this is not the case. As we learned in the first module, it stands for the Food and Drug Administration. And actually, the food component is one of the largest components at the US FDA. The US FDA is a part of the Department of Health and Human Services, and it is overseen by a commissioner who is known officially as the Commissioner of Food and Drugs. This is a post that has now been established by law. It's a presidential appointment, so it is a political appointment. It requires Senate confirmation, and the person who has this job is responsible to the Secretary of HHS and to the President. So they serve at the pleasure of both the President and the Secretary. This you'll see is a bit different than in many other agencies in high-income countries, where the chief executive of the medicines regulator is a person who has a certain term in office. But in the United States, it is a political appointment that serves at the pleasure of the president. As I mentioned earlier, FDA is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. Other organizations that you might have heard of, such as the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and the NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, are also part of HHS. The senior executives in those two organizations report to the Secretary of HHS, just like the Commissioner reports to the Secretary of HHS. But one of the differences with FDA is that it is the only real regulatory entity within HHS. And sometimes, as you'll see, this regulatory oversight sometimes extends to the CDC and to NIH when they become involved in activities which fall under the regulatory remit of FDA. One of the things that is a difference, I think, in the way we have congressional oversight of the FDA in the United States versus parliamentary oversight of regulators in other countries is that the Secretary of HHS is not a member of Congress, whereas the Minister of Health in countries outside the US who have a parliamentary system is a member of Parliament. So there is much more of a direct parliamentary oversight of the regulators as opposed to the more indirect administrative oversight, but much more directive budgetary oversight that we see here in the United States. When we look at FDA, again, I think most Americans tend to think of it first and foremost as the drug regulator. But as you can see from this slide, actually, in addition to prescription, over-the-counter, and homeopathic drugs, the FDA is responsible for approximately 80% of the U.S. food supply. The part of the food supply that FDA does not oversee are products that basically end up going through conventional slaughterhouses. So beef, pork, poultry. Those are overseen by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But the other 80%, seafood, vegetables, processed food, infant formulas, all the rest falls under the remit of FDA. FDA is also responsible for what are known as dietary supplements here in this country, but I think it's important for people to remember that under the law, dietary supplements are considered foods. They're not considered medical products, and they are overseen in the same way FDA oversees food products in this country. FDA is also responsible for vaccines, biopharmaceuticals, and the safety of the U.S. blood supply. It's responsible for medical devices, including all the various diagnostics. It's responsible for radiation-emitting devices, animal drugs and feed, cosmetics, and most recently, Congress added tobacco products to the list of our responsibilities for which FDA has oversight. Now, the way it does this is different for these different kinds of products. Probably the human drugs and animal drugs, the vaccines, the biopharmaceuticals, and the blood supply probably have the most stringent pre-authorization and authorization oversight. But these are clearly outside the scope of the talk today. We're going to be focusing on how FDA regulates the human medical products part of its portfolio. One of the things that you will see, and particularly as we compare FDA to EMA later in this particular module, is that both of them have a mission that is very common, and that is to protect and promote human health. But the way they do it, and particularly the issue of who is the final authority, is really quite different between FDA and EMA. In the United States, FDA is the final authority by law, acting for the Secretary for authorizing medical products. This is quite different, for example, than what you will see in Europe, where the EMA is the coordinating body and coordinates the work of the Committee for Human Medicinal Products that we mentioned in the previous module. This particular committee, which is the highest scientific committee within the human medicines regulatory system in Europe, does not have the final authority on authorizing a product in Europe. It makes a recommendation to the European Commission, and the Commission actually has the final authority on issuing the authorization of a product within Europe. When you look at how FDA is organized, it's probably not surprising that it's organized by centers that focus on the various products that fall within FDA's portfolio. There is an Office of the Commissioner. There is an Office of Regulatory Affairs, which is an interestingly named office because what it really is the inspectorate. It is the enforcement arm of FDA. It is the arm that actually has offices in many parts of the country and has the inspectors that go into the manufacturing plants, that go to the clinical trial sites to gather the evidence that indeed clinical trials are conducted in the way they should be conducted and that products are being manufactured in compliance with good manufacturing practices. There's also a National Center for Toxicological Research, which is a research branch of the FDA located in Arkansas that is responsible for doing some primary bench science into some of the safety issues that come about products and classes of products that FDA is responsible for. But the work of actually overseeing the various products, as I mentioned, fall to these various centers. There is a Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, a Center for Veterinary Medicine, a Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, for tobacco products. But the two that are the most critical when it comes to the oversight of human medical products are the Center for Biological Evaluation and Research, known by its abbreviation CBER, and the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, known by its abbreviation CDER. So in this module, you'll often hear me refer to CBER and CDER. That's just so you don't have to listen to the long names for these centers every time we want to talk about the work that they're doing. FDA as an organization now has approximately 15,000 employees. It's headquartered in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is a northern suburb of Washington, D.C. There are about 10,000 employees in the D.C. area. The other 5,000 are spread primarily at the 223 field offices and 13 laboratories that we have at FDA throughout the United States, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. These are the people who primarily are in that Office of Regulatory Affairs, that inspectorate that I was speaking about a few minutes ago. And since 2008, FDA has had several offices located overseas. There is an FDA office in China, there's one in India, there's one in Europe, and there are a series in Latin America. All of these report to the Office of International Programs in the Office of the Commissioner, and later in these modules we'll talk a little bit more in depth as to why these offices were developed and what kind of work they do in these countries to further the public health mission of the FDA. When you think about the impact of an organization like FDA, it's amazing if you look at that list of products that's in its portfolio, and you realize that these products account for approximately 25% of consumer spending in the United States. That means for every dollar that consumers spend here in the United States, 25 cents is being spent on a product that FDA is responsible for. This amounts to about $1 trillion annually in commerce. To oversee this, FDA has a current annual budget of about $5 billion. $2 billion of this come from what are called user fees that manufacturers pay for various services that FDA provides. $3 billion, however, comes from U.S. Treasury funds, which come from general taxation here in the U.S. We'll talk about user fees a little bit later, but just to give you an early insight into some of these and to continue this theme of comparing FDA with some of the other high-income country regulators, FDA user fees are much more comprehensive than the way that other countries do their user fees. In the U.S., for example, in the world of drugs and biologics, there are fundamentally 3 fees. There's a fee that the manufacturers pay when they present a manufacturing authorization dossier. There is, once a product is authorized in the U.S., there is an annual product fee, and there's an annual manufacturing fee that actually goes to help defray the costs for overseeing the ongoing oversight of the manufacturing of the product as it is distributed throughout the country. In other countries, for example, in Europe, rather than having 3 more or less comprehensive fees, they have a much more a la carte approach, where each of the services, for example, you would pay a fee for scientific advice, you would pay a fee for an application, you would pay a fee for some of the post-authorization activities that are going on. In the U.S., as you can see, the user fees account for about 40% of the budget that we have here in the United States, whereas in other countries, the user fees are actually full cost recovery for the activities that go on there. When you think about the cost to each American, the activities of the FDA for all of their activities, from food to tobacco to drugs to devices, it costs each American about $9 a year for the activities that FDA provides.